very much. I'm really excited to start this panel on decentralized IP, so over to you.
Hi there, thanks very much for coming to listen to us talk about IP and DeSci. I'm joined by a panel of IP and research translation experts today. And so I'd very much like everyone to introduce themselves and what it is that they do in the sort of life science translation and IP protection space.
Can I start?
Yes.
So I'm Veronique, I'm the Director of Translation at the Crick Institute, so we're hosting you today. We're a biomedical research institute. We have about 1,300 researchers under one roof, and our mission is to understand the underlying biology of health and disease. So we are a fundamental research institute. Our ambition is to be multidisciplinary and to help translate some of our research into benefit for patients. So my background is I've spent about 20 years in research and development in pharma companies, and then I came to the Crick 7 years ago when it was started, and I've built the translation science and the commercialization of translation at the Crick.
Hi, so I'm Amy. I am a patent attorney. I started my career, like many of you, as an academic. I did a PhD in clinical neuroscience. I quickly realised that for many of the reasons people have been discussing, academia was a very difficult environment to work in. So I pivoted away, retrained as a patent attorney, and now I work in private practice in biotech specifically, helping my clients get patent protection for sort of new biotech inventions.
Hi, I'm Chris Burns. I'm an IP legal advisor at Molecule, and I'm involved on the IP teams of a lot of the different BioDAOs, especially those that have come out of BioXYZ and VitaDAO. My work in this space is largely these days focused on trying to think of how we can fractionalize IP NFTs into sort of developing and enabling new means for community co-governance and ideally to co-commercialization of the IP that we may be generating. I'm a patent lawyer, sort of in my, I still have a private practice at an entity called Calyx Law, where we focus a lot on actually the psychedelic space in the US. But my background before that too was mostly in big tech, a patent litigator for international trade courts. I have a physics background, so oftentimes I'm way out of my league when chatting with all the brilliant life science people around here, but got really interested in IP NFTs as sort of a novel legal technology that could be used to tool up and help empower some experimental IP licensing that I've done over the past decade or so, mostly in the corporate accountability space and on things connected to human rights and thinking a lot about IP ethics and ways to connect IP into issues of community concern. So I guess that's me.
Hi, I'm Sarah Holland. I'm a patent attorney at a company called Potter Clarkson. I've been doing this for about 9 years. Before that I was a postdoc for 8 years at the University of Nottingham. All my scientific background's around yeast molecular biology, so I'm quite well aware of a lot of the screwed up things in academia that you've all been trying to talk about, and I'm quite interested to see how DeSci might be able to help some of the things, particularly around grant funding and trying to get PhD students and postdocs recognised as researchers in their own right. Everyone defines themselves as belonging to their PI, which I hate. So I work with a lot of scientist founders, particularly in biotech and in particular synthetic biology companies. I do a lot of IP education for academic institutes because I left university when I was 33 and I knew nothing about IP, when really I should have probably known quite a bit about IP. Yes, that's me.
And I'm Colin McCall. I'm a commercialisation lawyer focusing very much on biotech, so IP commercialisation. So I work with companies, typically companies, at all stages of their life cycle. So typically when they're at the sort of the point of spinning out from an academic or research institution, and then all the way through their various different sort of funding rounds and their licensing and microtransactions. So that's us. Just wanted to, so first thing I want to talk about actually is one of the key things that has been identified in as a challenge for DeSci is answering questions around IP, and so and the treatment of IP, and so I thought it'd be quite useful to sort of talk about what the current paradigm is in drug discovery and development. And so actually, Veronique, you're probably one of the best people to sort of talk about the sort of the process through which at the start, how's the process start?
I guess the commercialisation of IP has two aspects that are fairly different. One is you have filed a patent, or your institution has filed a patent, because in the UK, your people you work for own your intellectual property. So your institution has filed a patent, and either you or your institution are working together to find the funding to be able to drive that innovation that you've developed in your lab, etc., towards impact. And that's quite slow and quite tedious, I think. So that's if you file a patent, and if you haven't filed a patent but you are a data scientist or you're a software engineer, or and then it's a different way of commercialization, and it takes a different process, different investors, etc., to be able to take your innovation towards the market and to patients. So one of the challenge I think is, how do we accelerate how innovation gets out on the market, and can we find new ways to do that while you maintain all the things you need to maintain to be able to do it. So I think that's two categories we could cover today. There is a difference when you file a patent and when you haven't filed a patent, which is still intellectual property, but you have to treat it differently.
And I suppose one other thing is, just talking about the drug discovery and drug development pathway, it's an extremely arduous and expensive process. So it takes, it's well known, it takes several, at least £1 billion, taking into account the failures, to get a drug to market, and typically over 10 years of concerted effort. Much of that effort and expenditure takes place after the science has been spun away from the academic institute and is done and funded by others. I just wanted to sort of hear other people's thoughts on just the current paradigm, because I'm very much in that current paradigm thing, so I'm very interested in hearing how DeSci can help.
I have no idea if it can help, because I did mean to say I know literally nothing about Web3 or blockchain, so today's been really useful for me to pick up some bits. But just in terms of like pharma, when COVID hit a few years ago, I had a little bit of a crisis, like, am I working for something evil and bad? Like trying to get people patents, is it a bad thing? And I spent a long time doing quite a bit of research into other systems. There's various competitions out there that try to fund the research that is needed to bring these drugs to market, and I just could not find anything that would work or look like it would work to incentivise somebody or anybody to spend that much money to get a drug to market. So I don't know, if people don't like patents, I still think they're the lesser of two evils, and I'm quite interested to see if everything what people have been talking about today can help.
And I think the current system works very well for certain players in certain situations, and then there are other players who fall through the gaps completely. And for me, this is where DeSci comes in, and DeSci can be quite helpful. It's almost an opportunity to link up the whole process. So if you're sort of fractionizing IP and you're putting all that on chain, you can potentially follow that right through from you as the inventor, and you've sort of got your IP that's then transferred. It's transferred to the institution. It's transferred. You've got funding bodies. There are sort of these mechanisms where you can link it all up. You can link it up to potentially other incentives. You can say if you've got IP in something that's gone to market, then potentially that could be as valuable to your reputation as, say, a Nature publication. And it's sort of, there's a lot of potential there. I think mechanisms are not necessarily in place right now, but I think there's a lot of potential there for it to sort of bridge some of these gaps and some of these holes where people are falling through the gaps almost, and you've got sort of very interesting basic research where there's not necessarily a clear commercial use case, or you've got some of the less ethical practices, shall we say, of people who will buy up IP so they can kill it because there's something that's maybe a competitor. And it's sort of, it provides opportunities in those spaces, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that the current system is fundamentally broken. I think there's been a lot of discussion around how academic incentives are fundamentally broken, which I probably would agree with, but I don't feel that the patent system is fundamentally broken. I think it has a certain use case, and that use case can work very well, but a patent isn't the right option for everyone, and that's also okay.
So I think that's really helpful. So what I'm hearing there is, the system is not necessarily broken, but there are ways in which Web3 can perhaps augment the current system. So, Chris, is that something that you would like to?
Great. Yeah. So it's interesting. I think so far we haven't yet seen an IP NFT run through a full life cycle. We've seen, less than a dozen, I think, be minted, and meaning IP NFTs as has sort of arisen in the BioDAO space. Some of the paths to monetization there might well end up leading to an exit where maybe a DAO does fund some sponsored research, takes ownership of at least the commercial rights of the IP, even if it's not perhaps legal ownership of the underlying IP itself, which may stay with the university. And then that IP ultimately, after some further development, after some of the data around all that research continues to come in, could still well be sort of have an exit to a large pharma company in a very traditional way, who could then fund the rest and take that drug to market. I'm sure that it will happen. There's also a lot of interest in trying to solve more than that, to try and say, well, we don't want the type of market power consolidation that comes from patents that go through this path in the first place. And I think there's a million amazing ideas happening in the space, including things like hypercerts and other means of doing retroactive funding to help fund public goods and really try and solve these problems that are really kind of structural failures in the broader economy, not just in IP system, but something where we just have a hard time getting incentives aligned to even do research for neglected drugs or whatever it may be with the current system. And so I think that DeSci, just as a new space for experimentation, is kind of all of this is on the table. Another point, though, I just want to add is me having spent so much time in the tech world and in the IP system in the tech world, which, at least in the US, it still dominates the vast majority of patent litigations. 50%, I think, of patent litigations in the US are through non-practicing entities, or things we might call patent trolls. Another 15% or so are operating companies that are wielding tech, computer, software-related patents. And then it's a smaller world, but obviously still a very high-value IP. That's life science and is biotech. But typically when you ask people in the tech world, is the IP system broken? And you could go from Samsung, I think the largest owner of IP on a patent-by-patent basis out there, down to a startup, and everyone would say, oh, it's terrible. It's completely broken because of the costs that are attendant to IP litigation and sort of engaging in the IP justice system more generally are so high that we have whole new markets arising around IP risk management. And then every year they're lobbying, trying to say we need to change this, that, or the other. And then on the other side of that lobbying aisle saying, no, it's working and we need it to work because we need to be able to bring life-saving drugs to market and we don't have any other good ways, is typically big pharma. And I guess I just find it exciting and maybe inspiring, again, as a hat tip to everyone in DeSci, that this instinct to say we need to change something about how the IP system is working in decentralized IP is actually coming first from the side that in the larger market has been a bit more protective of it. It's actually bench scientists saying, no, we want to do IP in a different way. And it's not coming in the first instance from the tech world, which is where one might expect. I just add that because I think it's interesting, but I probably don't have more to share other than those thoughts. So.
Yeah, sorry, Bernie. Yeah.
I was just wondering if we need to make the differentiation as well, which is I think the scientific community now, we all buy into open science and putting our data openly out there. I think everybody a bit to that now, everybody wants to do it. And when we do that, it's free for everybody to use. There is no intellectual property on that data. It's what people do with it that can become intellectual property. But I think as a community, we need to put data out there for everybody and then let everybody has a chance to work on that data. And I think that's really important. And the one missing link, I think, also is how do we annotate and integrate our data? Because at the moment when we publish, it's very difficult to integrate. So there is another role of I think us as a community to have a better platform for integration. And we were talking about reproducibility and credibility, and that's also important, the annotation. Because I think that people can't reproduce because not everything is there in the method, but if everything was there. The other thing that I think is really important in the intellectual property side is actually there will be a lot of saving of money if we did publish what didn't work, but we can't patent it. So that's another side of the data that I think we should put all together.
So that brings me on to another point in that, so the making of scientific research data available to all, and that's what we're all bought into. But if you're going to, if there is some sort of very valuable research and results that come out of that data, then you need to patent that before, or at least put in an application for a patent before making that underlying data available.
You could decide to do that, or you could decide not to do it.
Yeah. So if you want to protect it, you need. If you want to get a patent, ultimately you have to. But if you're open-minded, very open science-minded, then perhaps you wouldn't. But I mean, do you see the way forwards as people increasingly not looking to patent certain sort of innovations?
I guess we've made a point, which is the need to have a patent is there to prevent other people to do the same thing, and that's where you get investment behind the innovation. So there is a need to do that, unless society turns upside down. I think that won't change. To get investment, you will need to have secure IP in some shape or form. Either you haven't shared your data, or you've put a patent application in.
And that is the point, isn't it, around drug development. It's so expensive to do. There's only one recognised way of recouping the massive costs, and that's through having exclusivity when you finally do come to market, and the best way of ensuring exclusivity is through the patent system. And I think it's a tried and tested model, and like sort of it's kind of a number of us here are saying we don't think that's broken, but like sort of, yeah, I'd be very interested to hear from others in the audience in a bit as to whether they think it's broken and what other sort of alternative methods there might be. But I guess, yeah, Sarah said you don't think there's any better way, but is there anybody else on the panel here who thinks that there might be a better way?
I guess I would say I think there's a need for more experimentation. I also think that generally speaking, the original purpose around intellectual property being something that's about sort of promoting progress, science, and useful arts is at least how it's put in the US Constitution. I think the financialization of how knowledge production the financialization of knowledge production in the current economy, I think, has pushed the whole market pretty far away from revisiting those sort of origin pieces and by content of research in life science. Because we're making medicines, I think it's easy for this part of the market to say, well, we are still promoting health, things that we need, things that are good. But I think I'm suspicious of whether the way the IP system operates can't be improved, I guess. And I'm certainly open and eager to listen to stakeholders in this space who have commented on how it's broken, which do include a lot of historically marginalized communities, indigenous peoples who are very worried about biopiracy, who've never really borne the fruits of a lot of intellectual property that's been extracted from those areas. And those are the difficult stories for IP lawyers. We know it happens and it's always painful, and generally we say, well, it doesn't happen too often. But I do think, generally speaking, that all the experimentation that we can do in trying to build a new economy, I guess there are efforts, I think, to try and do this without patents. And I guess I'm optimistic in seeing what they may sort of show.
So I guess I don't tend to think it was better or worse. I think this is an option, and it's, as I said, an option that works very well in certain situations, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't be exploring other options. And I think also we need to appreciate that drug development is a very unique case in that you've got these sort of very, very high startup costs, very high failure rate, very high levels of specialist knowledge and training, and that just isn't the case in other industries, and the considerations aren't the same. The other thing I wanted to say is I think there's something of a jurisdictional difference, which so Chris is talking about the US, and I think there are actually quite a lot of differences between Europe and the US and the rest of the world in what IP exists and how patents are treated. And a lot of companies won't even bother patenting outside. They'll sort of patent in Europe, the US, Australia, Canada, Japan, China. Then they won't have even bothered filing patents in Nigeria or Argentina. So it's a lot of this IP is sort of existing in certain jurisdictions, and it's regulated very differently in different jurisdictions. I think places like Brazil and India have specific provisions about indigenous knowledge and how you can use it that again don't exist in the US. In Europe, we've sort of got cost awards that discourage some of the frivolous, ridiculous patent troll litigation that you get in the US. I think there are sort of a lot of very specific problems, and I think when we're talking about IP and different IP systems and what works and what doesn't, we almost need to be very modular about it and say this, in this specific circumstance for this group of people in this place solving this problem, this is what will or won't work, rather than sort of trying to make these sweeping statements about everything's broken and let's have a solution that will fix everything, because that's kind of just not the reality on the ground.
And I mean, one thing that sort of occurred to me is that are we trying to sort of rebalance some of the sort of incentives and rewards of development, in that is there a concern that the people who come up with the sort of the founding kernel of the innovation that ultimately becomes a blockbusting drug for a Pfizer, let's say. Is there a concern amongst this community that perhaps too much of that reward goes to the likes of, well, to the big pharma, and not enough of it goes to the founding academics? And is there a way? I'm seeing nods in the crowd here, and so if that's the case, is that perhaps a use case for Web3 somehow to allocate credit in a different way?
Shall I go again?
Go on.
I think to me this is probably one of my favourite use cases, is that if you've got mechanisms, you've got accountability, you've got a way of tracking, and quite often that's just completely disjointed, and you've got your early stage research where people are completely motivated by publication, by prestige, by reputation. They've not really given any thought to commercialisation. That will then go through the tech transfer office, it will be spun out, it will be sold, it will go to a company. That company will do the future development, and there's no disconnect, no aligned incentives, so the people who did the original development are just not thinking about the commercial side, and the people who are doing the commercial side that's all that they're interested in. And then when you sort of get other players coming in, you've got sort of the patient advocacy groups who maybe contributed to the funding, and if they're funding the early stage research, that then gets picked up later by another party who just have, I think this is probably one of my favourite use cases, is this idea that there could be a way to keep everyone in the loop throughout the process and keep all those incentives aligned, and the people who were involved at the very beginning and did that sort of core work, when that becomes a blockbuster drug, the money doesn't just go to Pfizer, it goes to everyone throughout the whole process.
Pfizer.
Sorry, Pfizer. We love you, Pfizer. But not to name names, it's just because Pfizer are the ones who've jumped into the space. But the profits don't just go to them, it trickles back down the chain, and everyone who's involved is either seeing profit or they're seeing the sort of reputational rewards. They're getting something that's equivalent to a Nature paper, in that their drug was bought and sold and they've got that acknowledgement, if that's what's more important. I mean, it's a contract, you write into it what you want. But I think that's a really, really interesting, important use case.
So just listening to what you said, is that we can do all that already, can't we? I'm named as an inventor on something, my name's on the patent application, that's on the record. If people wanted to do it, we can keep a record.
That's only true if it's patented. That's not true if it's data.
It could be, no, but there's
the
nothing stopping that being
blockchain
written down when you, right, I've got this data, I'm going to license it to you, I was the originator of the data, and I want to be named as that, as the license goes through to the ultimate end user. So I don't know, I feel like everything that people talk about makes it faster and smarter and quicker and more permanent, but then it's up to us to kind of say, that's what we want to do, and then just do it.
I feel it's difficult for data. So if you've generated, I don't know, proteomic data, 100,000 data points, and somebody develops something on the top of it, it's very difficult for the researchers to track how their data has been used into a product, and I think that's where the blockchain could be used. And some companies use it already, like Federate Learnings and all those things. So I think people use it already. I think finding a way to do it that is efficient would be great. I agree with you, when people have filed a patent, you're an inventor, you can track. But it's also a way to tracking your impact, which is very difficult, because when you start something, let's say somebody develop a drug based on a gene you've invented or something, it will take 20 years. So how do you know that, the gene you discovered somewhere 20 years before, you've been the one? I mean, if you're a poor nurse and you discover cell division, it's different. But I think it is important to have tracking your impact too. So all those things I think are important for us to think of a community, tracking your impact. It's very difficult, it takes a long time. So Greg Winter, antibodies, well of course everybody knows he's impacted the world, but it's not obvious. So I think there is some really interesting things to discover how to do better.
Can I just say one more thing? Sorry, I feel like it's just me talking. as someone said earlier, you don't necessarily need it to be Web3 based. Like Web3 is a tool. It's a tool that can sort of make things potentially easier, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way to do them. And I agree, we could definitely do this without Web3. We can do this completely. We could do this with pieces of paper. But I think what Web3 it's almost the mindset. It sort of offers an opportunity to rethink. We're designing these new tools. We can think about what we want to design into these tools so that we can make things more efficient, more seamless. And ultimately, if you're sort of in the publish or perish world, people are looking at your H factor. They're not necessarily looking at what patents you filed and where you filed them and whether that innovation did or didn't get. Whereas if you've got a system that's automatically pulling all that in and you've got that sort of feeding into your H factor already, that's sort of, it's just making it so much easier. I think a lot of incentivization is just about ease. It's about lowering the barriers to resistance. If something is seamless, people will do it. If it's difficult, then they won't.
So yeah, just sort of putting into that sort of barriers. A lot of what I do in my practice is due diligence on IP assets around programs that are being out-licensed. And so a lot of that is around chain of title. Now, I wonder, is there a way Web3 can sort of impact and sort of reduce, and getting me involved on that and my team is an expensive process, and it takes time, and it's not massively exciting. So there are other things that I'd rather be spending my time on than looking through chain of title documents.
So when I was, before Web3, doing some large defensive patent aggregator deals, we may have 60,000 patents that had to be done in a single deal. And it would cost easily $50,000 to $100,000 in due diligence costs. Make deals be much slower. It was all because chain of title around who actually owned a patent was so difficult to track down. Even when an entity, if you're a large institution with a lot of IP, you might not even know or really be able to show yourself that you have the right chain of title. Maybe someone at some point forgot to get the right assignment from an inventor who was working for them, or if the patents had already been through some transactions, it can be even more difficult to kind of track that down. So I think simply using distributed ledger technology, both to track IP ownership, and also I think where I get especially excited is to use DLT as a licensing ledger and actually have people understand and be able to see easily through fractional tokens or some other tokenization model who actually already has a license, where there might already be encumbrances on a certain piece of IP. And if you did that and just ran ETHScan or anything to kind of see what encumbrances, who owns things, and what are already out there, you're saving tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in a robust IP transaction, and less, but still a significant amount for smaller transactions. And so that alone, I think, the idea of bringing IP into Web3 and really approaching IP in ways we might be able to build things like trusted IP networks, IP commons, different things that have robust licensing schemes, but that can also be organized around decreasing the cost of doing business, just generally with IP, decreasing the risk and cost attendant to an IP dispute, decreasing licensing transaction costs, improving and sort of decentralizing the due diligence that might go into IP quality control, having a DAO filled with the most brilliant minds out there help validate whether a patent should have issued.
That's really interesting. Because there are a lot of bad patents there. Apologies to my colleagues who I'm sure haven't drafted any of those. But yeah, how do you see sort of Web3 sort of improving the patenting system, as in making sure that bad patents don't get onto the books?
In my ideal world, and something that we've been chatting about in different different channels, is to think in the first place of what might happen if we took a DAO, even maybe created some bounties to put some economic interest behind it, and just kind of watch what happens during prosecution of a patent, and you're getting office actions back saying this claim is invalid because this prior art reference, or this claim is insolubly vague, different things that have to go into the technicalities of applying for a patent. And meanwhile, that the poor examiner in most offices, sort of cross-jurisdictionally, are maybe spending less than 10 hours on a review. They're incentivized to grant. They certainly don't have the amount of education and talent, not to say they're incredibly well-educated and talented, but compared to the people we have in this room, compared to people who are leading bench scientists, what if we just took 3 people from those DAOs and just saw if they could outperform what examiners typically doing on some determination on the merits, should that patent have been granted, such that all of a sudden when a patent is granted, if you have another DAO giving some quality control stamp to it and saying, this is actually good IP, this is something we believe, if it were litigated, would probably stand up. And this other one, if it were litigated, we think that thing's done. That type of work is being done in patent IP insurance companies now, actuarial models. There's big market money behind wanting people to out-predict what happens with IP when it gets asserted, just because the problem is so notorious that, again, in the US, half of all patents that are asserted and actually get a ruling on the merits are found invalid. A coin toss. And those that have been challenged intentionally inside the patent office, in the first couple of years in the US under the American Invents Act, it was 93% invalidation of claims done through inter partes review proceedings, these means of challenging patents. And selection bias, you're going to challenge the weakest patents, but that level of problem, de-risking IP justice and the cost of doing business, I think Web3 has the most. I'm very bullish on what Web3 has to offer there.
Is that the Web3 part, or is it people in the DAO, which to me is separate?
Yeah, I think having people organized in a DAO, I think one of the biggest obstacles that arise when you try and do collective bargaining outside of Web3 is trust. The entities who do it, RPX, some of these other ones, it's a black box that you can't tell the other members what another member's paying, even though you're all getting rates to the same deal. Not because it's not economically rational. Like, big corporates will do what's economically rational all the time, but they can't go into their C-suite and tell them, well, we're paying more. I'm Apple, I'm paying more than Samsung, or I'm Pfizer, I'm paying more than Moderna or something for this. That's where all of a sudden the things kind of stop transactions that otherwise should happen. But if you can have a trustless but transparent platform like a blockchain to pool money, sort of pool risk, decentralize the costs of it, and have that interaction just be perhaps through an anonymous wallet that there's so many different ways you can go about enabling the kind of game theory that you need to solve for that stops a lot of effective patent risk management and the like now. I think Web3 can help unlock that.
I'm conscious that we've done all the talking, but interested to hear if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, there are a few.
There's a lot, right? We've only got a few minutes, so
Yeah.
guys are going to have to be quick. You can go first. So your hand up.
Isn't it kind of good that patents are expensive? Because otherwise it's like, if they're cheap, you can just patent everything, right?
You still have to get it through the patent office. It still has to be new and inventive and patentable. So maybe it's good. It'd be better if it was cheaper, so people can patent all the technology that should be patentable.
I think it also means that the only people who can access the patent system are people who are already wealthy. And I think that has some very significant structural implications for how IP participates in some, what I would say is structural sort of bias and problems in the economy more generally, but I appreciate the point.
Would you talk about conversion of existing patents or only new methodology moving forward?
Sorry, can you ask that one again?
Conversion of existing patents into NFTs. or sort of are we talking about a new methodology moving forward?
Yeah, you can put existing patents on chain. Like the protocol that Molecule is launching it's really just a process of taking IP the legal rights and tokenizing those legal rights. But those legal rights can be anything from a sponsored an IP assignment and a sponsored research agreement to, in theory, IP ownership even inside a corporation amongst shareholders. Or perhaps it might be, I mean, one could even tokenize an individual claim. You know, they have full flexibility in taking the exclusive right that is the IP right, tokenizing it, and then playing around with it, regardless of how sort of mature or at what point a government has or hasn't sort of validated the existence of that exclusive right. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
One more, yeah. Oh, good shot.
Oh.
Yeah, nice.
Hi, good throw. So is anybody doing the work to sort of forecast, so a lot of the sentiment is around actually restoring a sense of power to a distributed research community in a sort of adversarial way to established industry. Is anybody doing the work to sort of forward forecast potentially any sort of gaming of this new legal technology by industry once they get on board, so that actually researchers aren't detrimentally impacted in the long term?
I think that's got to be one for Chris. I mean, you've got Pfizer on your...
Yeah, I think there's a lot of thought being sort of done around this, and I've no doubt that if the technology gets adopted the way we hope, it's going to be gamed and there's going to be terrible, you know, it's like any technology. I think similar to what happened with the internet. Yeah, I mean, right, so Google went from do no evil as a motto to then silently cutting that out of its whole corporate charter, you know, once it actually became such a dominant market player. Open source software, the same thing. You know, it starts with an idealism around copyleft that says, well, everything's going to become copyleft, and then copyleft became a virus in terms of the software in the eyes of many large corporates, and now open source is oftentimes just used sometimes to, well, can be used to simply reify existing market dominance. And so for scientists, I think, unless DeSci makes a point of saying, we start to own and occupy the IP that we create ourselves as individuals, which sounds very labor, you know, IP producers unite the kind of idea. Yeah, I mean, sure, count me in, you know, let me know. But without that, absolutely, I think there'll be bad things that come from it, just because it's freedom in human nature. I don't know.
I mean, one of the concerns there might be that, you know, vested interests might sort of gain access to the IP rights and then, as you put it earlier, Amy, kill it. Is there a way that we can sort of prevent that from happening?
I think again, I'm really big on trying to create tools for the autonomous scientist that allow scientists producing IP, DAOs, broader community, to encode ethical encumbrances onto the IP right itself. And these things can get really clever, so that should the IP make its way into the hands of an entity who behaves in a particular way, which can be prescribed by careful sort of thought what that behavior looks like, then you might say there's a free license for everyone, or there's springing licenses, there's different mechanisms that can be used. This is how patent trolls, which are sort of the most notorious and kind of most simplistic bad actor with IP, behave now. There's networks with 2,500 plus members who have top, I mean, again, larger than big tech, but this is coming into life science as well, who promise that should their IP ever go into the hands of a troll, it's a springing license for everyone else in the network, so the troll can't sue them. I think we need to do types of things to be very intentional about how we ensure our IP doesn't just, we don't open it up in a way to reify the bad behavior we're expecting, but bad behavior, people are creative with bad behavior as well. So I think it's going to be much like one does with security software. It's an ongoing game. you know, who can write the next best virus, and then who can write the next best layer of security software to beat it. I think that's the level of what we'll be operating in, what I would refer to as these IP networks.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.